and welcome back to Book and Page. We are so very close to the end of The Hobbit, with 2 chapters to go. We are on chapter 18, The Return Journey. So now, it's the denouement from here on out. We left Bilbo knocked unconscious during a battle, so let's do a summary and figure out what actually happened after that point. So we start the chapter with Bilbo waking up to find that the battle is won, but at great cost. He pulls off his ring finally. Poof! He's now visible and located by people looking for him. And Bilbo is brought to see Thorin on his deathbed. Now Thorin asks for forgiveness before he dies, and Bilbo gives it to him and goes quietly to weep because he just lost a good friend, and he's glad they parted as friends. We hear about the Eagles' full involvement in the battle and how they got there, and finally the appearance of Bjorn as a bear. It's noted that Bjorn actually goes in and pulls Thorin out of battle before going back in to continue to fight. So we get a significant show of mercy there, as well as righteous fury against the goblins. Bard leaves the Arkenstone to be buried with Thorin, and the Wood Elf actually echoes this by leaving the sword that he took from Thorin back in his kingdom to be buried with him as well. And in fact, at that burial we find out we did not just lose Thorin, we lost Fili and Kili as well, who died defending their uncle. The company doesn't get their share of the treasure, but Dane does give 1/14 to Bard in honor of the agreement that Bard made with Thorin in exchanging the Arkenstone for 1/14 of the treasure. So Dane does keep that agreement. From that, Bard pays a lot of people. He wants to also reward Bilbo, but because Bilbo has so far to travel, he only takes 2 small chests. And then we get a series of sort of moving moments. So Bilbo leaves the mountain, where he tells the dwarves that his home is always open to them, and he'll always be willing to have them for tea. We have him paying the Wood King back for the food he stole at the entrance to Mirkwood. But they decide, and they, I mean Bjorn, Gandalf, and Bilbo decide to actually go around Mirkwood back to Bjorn's home, where they spend the winter with Bjorn. But when spring appears, Bilbo desperately wants to return to his own armchair. So the last we actually see is Bilbo and Gandalf beginning the crossing of the Misty Mountains. So a lot happened in this chapter, between flashbacks and endings. So let's do a bit of a breakdown, and I think of course the first thing we have to acknowledge is the death of Thorin, because this is really the only meaningful death that we really see of an ally. We certainly understand that during the battle and following the battle that we lost a lot of other people, but all of that loss is actually spoken to in Thorin's death. That is the meaningful moment that consolidates the elves and the men and the dwarves and all these lives lost is discussed and handled within Thorin's death. And this is often how it's actually done, because you need to have a meaningful connection with somebody who we lose in the battle to really get a meaningful connection with everybody that we lose in the battle. Because everything that applies to Thorin here also applies to everybody else we lost. So we actually get sort of Thorin's final and true repentance when he asks Bilbo's forgiveness in these last few moments of his life. And in truth, in some ways, Bilbo understood Thorin's choices. He admits that he himself never made the full moral choices in a lot of this. He took the Arkenstone without Thorin's permission and gave it away when he really didn't have the right to do that. But Thorin recognizes the difference now. He didn't before, but he does now. He reminds Bilbo that he was acting as least selfishly as he could, because he was trying to save lives, and he was trying to save his friends, despite them sort of being so loopy at that point that they didn't even realize it, and in fact blamed him for it. And that has meaning. It's really meaningful that Bilbo cared enough for the dwarves, even when they started to become poor people towards him, that he tried to help them, and he tried to fix their own moral failings through actions of his own. So I think we really need to read Thorin's, at least the end of Thorin's speech. He's not as long-winded in this speech as he is in others, because he is very much on his last legs. So Bilbo says that this adventure was more than a Baggins deserves, and Thorin says, "No, there is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." Wow, yeah, now, very short little speech from Thorin, but very meaningful, because he points out that it's the simple community things that make life enjoyable. It's not holding gold. Gold makes you greedy and makes you materialistic and a poor judge when it comes to actions and character and things like that. But food and song and cheer, those are the things that, when shared, bring spirits up. They make people feel better. They make a community better. And Thorin's recognizing it now. But the other thing we have to acknowledge is that those meaningful things are utterly destroyed when greed and violence takes over. And that's actually personified in the loss of Fili and Kili. Because Fili and Kili did care about those things. They were the dwarves playing music rather than sifting through the piles of gold. They were the ones sitting there with the harps, because they liked music over gold. And they valued family. They died defending their uncle. But they still died. The battles still destroyed them. But that's because violence overflows. Violence does not just affect those who are greedy and violent-minded. That greed overflows, and it affects everyone. Bilbo was affected, Fili and Kili were affected. So what actually happens is this recognition that you need to choose the smaller things that make life meaningful much earlier on. You can't sort of make that decision right at the end, because the end is usually too late. You need to choose food and cheer and company and song over gold much earlier on, and you need to stick to that. You need to be the dwarves sitting there playing harps while everybody else goes through the gold. You need to be Bilbo, who's just like, I'd trade all of this for like a good hearty meal, if I'm honest. Because if you don't make that choice, then a lot more people get hurt, including people who do make that choice. And it's interesting because we don't just get Thorin and Bilbo admitting their mistakes here. Bard and the Wood King recognize their own similar choices and mistakes in the end as well, because they each return what they took from Thorin, which would be the Arkenstone and Thorin's sword. What we're seeing here is that forgiveness needs to be offered by everybody, and needs to be accepted by everybody. Which is why it's really important that Dain keeps his bargain with Bard about the Arkenstone. Thorin no longer can be that accepting force, so Dain has to step up and be true to that bargain, and give the agreed upon 14th share to Bard. Because if he doesn't, then we just return to a cycle of violence. That cycle needs to end here. And so we see that in a major way with Dain's agreement with Bard, but we also see it in a smaller way when Bilbo, when they're parting from the Wood King at Mirkwood, admits that he was in the Wood King's halls, stole from him and helped his prisoners escape, and then actually gives the Wood King a gift as an apology. Everything has to be admitted here. All wrongs have to be laid down, laid out to be judged, and then the hope is that the other person recognizes, to end the cycle of violence, those mistakes and choices and sins, as they were, need to be forgiven. You need to admit your guilt, and then the other side needs to forgive your guilt in order for this cycle to end. To defend community and positive growth for everybody, you need to admit your guilt, and that guilt needs to be forgiven. And that is a really hard thing to do. But people can do it. And there have been real-life examples of forgiveness in an attempt to end this cycle of violence. So the fact that Tolkien has spoken to that in this chapter just makes me very happy. Because it is a real-life thing, but it is one of the hardest things to personify, and one of the hardest things that some people will ever do in their lives. Okay, a little more on the positive side, and a little more quickly. Tolkien's a bit notorious for this whole multiple endings thing. The Lord of the Rings is even worse than this, but even The Hobbit, we sort of have ending happening in stages. So we actually get 3 endings in this chapter alone, and then the 4th ending is really the last chapter in itself. So we end the dwarves' tale at the mountain. We've gotten them home, they are there to stay, and we get a really direct acknowledgement because Bilbo actually names them each in turn. He doesn't refer to them as a group. He calls them all by name and invites them, if they're ever by his home, to come and visit him. And that his door is always open to them. He will feed them and shelter them without a second thought, which is a big difference from what we saw at the very start, where we don't get as an open house as Bilbo's offering here. We then get the ending to the Elven story, the Wood Elf story at Mirkwood, with that admittance of guilt and forgiveness between the Wood King and Bilbo. And it's not just Bilbo, it's not one-sided. Bilbo's not like, here are my sins, and the Wood King's like, cool, you're forgiven. The Wood King actually gives 2 titles to Bilbo. He calls him Elf Friend, which we're told in the last chapter that Bilbo retained through the rest of his life. But he also gives him the title the Magnificent, which is interesting because this is a title that we've seen used with Smaug. But rather than with Smaug when it was referring to material wealth, for Bilbo it's his virtues. It's his selfishness and kindness and humbleness. Humbleness is actually being referred to here. And it is this recognition that we need to start reclaiming those terms and reordering those terms to step out of the cycle of violence and become better people. And then of course we've got Bjorn's story ending in the spring after he's hosted Bilbo and Gandalf for the entire winter. So we've already seen that Bjorn has grown, because he didn't want to have any of these guests. He doesn't like having friends over at his house. And he's become a better host now, because he takes Bilbo and Gandalf in for an entire season, which is longer than I think a lot of us would like visitors in our house. So Bjorn has become a better host. He's more social and he's kinder. And in fact, we're told that he grows into a great chief after this point, because he has learned to open his home, and I think in a lot of other ways to open his heart as well, so that he does encourage growth in this area and encourage community within this area. So the last chapter coming up is Gandalf and Bilbo past the Misty Mountains. They're passing the Misty Mountains on their way home at the end of this chapter. And it's interesting because the group, of course, gets smaller with each one of these endings. But that's so Bilbo can return home as a hobbit. And that's probably a weird way to say it, but he's really changed throughout this entire journey. And to return home as fully changed as he is would destroy him. He wouldn't be able to do it. But he's letting go in bits and pieces as he's going through. He's letting go of traveling with these 13 companions at the mountain, but acknowledging they're always going to be friends and they're welcome in his home. He's letting go of the morally gray choices he made with the Wood Elf kings by acknowledging those choices and apologizing for them, and he's letting that go. He's stripping bits and pieces away while retaining the important bits, so that he can go home and not be overwhelmed by all of this. And we're going to see sort of the final stages of this in the last chapter. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.